Mark.
Hi, Ross. How are you?
Good. How are you?
Good. Good. Good to hear your voice.
Good to hear yours.
Bob Wright said that it was 1 year ago that we first did Blogging Heads, which is like I didn't even know Blogging Heads existed for a year.
That's actually a terrifying thought.
Yeah. I didn't even know the internet existed for a year.
Let's not dwell on that.
All right.
Old age is catching up. Okay. Let's dwell instead on my failures as a pundit, because I didn't watch the Democratic presidential debate, which happened last night, and you did.
That's correct.
So
I did.
maybe we could kick off by you giving me your impressions, so I don't have to watch it at all.
What's your excuse? That you're not going to vote for any of these guys, so you don't care what they think?
Well, you know, it was my fiance's birthday this weekend. There was the Sopranos was on last night. There was a lot of stuff floating around.
All good excuses. Okay, good excuses. Well, I can't say you missed much. That was too notable. I have to say it was. I was ready to. I haven't heard this reaction from anybody. I was ready to throw cans at the TV. I don't usually get worked up about the moderation of a debate, but in the second half of it, you know, it's Wolf Blitzer and then the New Hampshire anchors and so forth. The second half was, you know, it was actual questions from ordinary citizens, and they were great questions. And for example, one person asked, how do we reconcile our support for Musharraf in Pakistan with our belief in liberal democracy? So Wolf Blitzer, you know, turns to, I don't remember whether it's Kucinich or Mike Gravel, one of the
important candidates,
gives them about 10 seconds to answer, and then says, okay, and turns it to the other candidates and basically pretends to be reinterpreting the question as, okay, if we find out Osama bin Laden's in Pakistan and we know where he is, do you go bomb him? You know? And then he does exactly the same thing, or he'd done exactly the same thing on an Iran question. Somebody asked a very thoughtful question about Iran. It was a woman who lived in Iran. Not thoughtful question that could open to all kinds of good discussion. Immediately turns into, when do you bomb Iran? And it was just so disgraceful that the people actually ask terrific questions, and they get turned into these, you know, moral showdown questions that really have nothing to do with the actual question of how do you construct a policy for the, you know, that really works with these difficult countries. So I found that very frustrating. But there was a little, it was good. There was a little, I mean, one of the sort of subtexts of the debate was a little pushback against that kind of questioning. Early on there was a discussion about immigration got instantly turned into English is the official language of the United States. Are you for it or against it? And Obama was pretty aggressive about turning on that as, you know, this is the kind of question that's just designed to divide us. You know, his typical shtick, and Senator Clinton did the same thing. I mean, they were all actually. Did anyone say they were for English as an official language? Yeah, Senator Mike Gravel did. He said he was for that.
So nobody did, right?
Which is funny because I think he actually grew up in like francophone New England. I think he's from Maine, or he's from.
Well, so he knows what he's talking about.
Yeah,
that's right.
He speaks French, so he knows.
Michel Gravel, right?
Yeah, well, there's a reason his name is pronounced that way, but he didn't have a very articulate case for it.
Maybe
it was just
if he'd been speaking in French, he would have done better. Yeah.
Yeah.
So did the debate? Well, first let me say it dovetails completely with my perceptions from particularly. Not the last Republican debate, but the Republican debate before that, where they would repeatedly give people questions and give them 20 seconds to answer. And I mean, part of that is just having so many candidates on the podium. But there is nothing that I don't always buy into the sort of blogospheric criticisms of the mainstream media for its relentless focus on trivialities and so on. And sometimes what the blogosphere thinks are trivialities, I think, are actually important. But
and the blogosphere has its own trivialities.
Exactly, right. But in the case of these debates, it really is, and taking your word for what last night was like, it really is hard not to see the extent to which, you know, all that these debates are designed to do is look for the Rudy Giuliani versus Ron Paul moment.
Right.
So, but did you come out of the debate feeling more impressed with any of the candidates?
Well, I mean, I think the consensus was. I think it was a reminder that Joe Biden can be a serious, thoughtful person.
When he has a time limit on how long
he has a time limit,
right?
He had a funny like his line on a number of issues, particularly talking about Darfur, was like he is there's been too much talking, it's time to do something. So he is now the candidate. His position is he's against talk, having built his entire life around
well, it's
talk.
Nixon goes to China, you know.
Yeah, he's taking a stand against talk, which he did in the previous debate too, when he actually gave a one-word answer to something. And the same, I think, with Senator Dodd. They both came off fine. I thought Senator Clinton was very, very good. Obama was, fine, but didn't really bring a strong distinction yet. Edwards pushed too hard at the beginning on trying to draw this. He's really trying to make more of the Iraq War vote distinction, I think, than can be made at this point. That's kind of a reminder to me. I mean, I guess I've always felt that at the end of the day, Democrats' positions about what to do about Iraq are going to be similar enough that the differences in their vote back in '03 are not going to be killer. And I think we're kind of getting to that point.
Well, particularly given that, in some sense, Edwards, it makes sense for him to be distinguishing himself from Hillary, but in another sense, he is competing for the anti-Hillary vote with Obama.
Right.
And that distinction doesn't help him at all on that front.
Right.
If anything, it makes him look worse because, he was wrong and Obama was right.
Right. Although it doesn't. He's learned his lesson. He has a whole sort of moral theory about what it meant to be wrong about that, and how he learned his lesson about that. There's a funny little element that's developed about that, which is this whole question of having read or not read the National Intelligence Estimate before the vote, which is a funny distinction to draw because that National Intelligence Estimate is mostly kind of garbage. It wasn't, it's part of the whole story of the manipulation of the CIA. It had never occurred to me that it would be hugely significant whether you'd actually read the NIE or not. And Edwards' answer to that, which I'm not sure when it came out that he hadn't read it, his answer was, I didn't really need to read it because I was on the Intelligence Committee, so I saw all this. I knew what the intelligence consensus was. And I think it was Obama hit back with an interesting point, which is that former Senator Bob Graham, who voted against the resolution, cited the NIE as a reason he voted against the resolution, which is a kind of killer twist, although Graham had a very eccentric set of reasons for opposing the resolution.
Yes, Graham had a fairly eccentric approach to foreign affairs generally.
Right.
If I'm remembering correctly.
Yeah. Although his reason maybe, I think it was a little more of, we would lose the focus on Al-Qaeda, which was not really language that people were using at the time, and of course turns out to be very much the case. But it was a little too, at the beginning, I felt that the overemphasis on what are now actually relatively small distinctions about Iraq didn't work well for Edwards. He can't milk that for as much as he thinks, and which is interesting because it's a reminder that underneath it all, if you have basic consensus around, you don't know what you're going to do, but you must find a way to end this war. If you have a basic consensus around that, then at least within the primaries, domestic issues do then come back up to the fore. Even if the distinctions there are not colossal, they're there and they're easy to talk about and they're easy to relate to people's lives.
Well, and some of it, I think Matt Iglesias actually made a good point, which is that, for the sake of, it clearly is the case that, you would get a different approach to ending the war in Iraq from Barack Obama versus John Edwards versus Hillary Clinton. And Matt made the point that, based on Hillary's history, it is reasonable to think that, she would be, say, less likely to pull out of Iraq precipitously than Obama would. But that's not the kind of thing that's going to come up in the debate, because in the debate they're all competing to say, I'm going to end the war in Iraq. So,
and I'm not even sure that that's true. I mean, I don't know that that's true, that she would be less likely to end it precipitously. I mean, you sit down in that Oval Office on January 21st of 2009, and I think you've got to, you just have to bring in everybody and try to. It's not an easy problem.
Right.
And they've gotten boxed into votes that make it seem like it could be treated as an easy problem. And Kucinich tried to force the issue of you can end the war tomorrow if you want to.
Right.
I mean, I do think underneath it all, there is an understanding that you can't just walk away.
Yeah.
And I don't know how they would actualize that. Maybe there are distinctions, but I don't think it's obvious what those distinctions
No,
would
I mean,
be.
and in general, I'm in the camp that's skeptical. I did a blog post about this actually that was sort of tangled and confused, but we sort of reached this interesting place where George W. Bush clearly wants to set up the post-Bush presidency landscape such that his successor is forced to stay in Iraq.
Right.
Right. But there's this interesting game going on where you have this moment upcoming in September or whenever when even Republicans are saying, well, no, this is the point where we have to start talking about timetables and so forth. And
right.
it's this interesting situation where you can actually see President Bush compromising, and that being in his interests. Insofar as his interest is to keep America in Iraq, that
right.
If he compromises on a timetable that leaves, say, 95,000 troops in Iraq when President Obama takes office, then, as you say, President Obama is going to have to sit down with 57 different experts and try and work his way through this. Whereas if Bush really digs in his heels, that's the only situation I can see where you could have a precipitous withdrawal before the next president takes office. And I don't think that's terribly likely, but it is sort of
right.
an interesting possibility to imagine where Bush becomes so isolated that, it actually becomes politically plausible for the Democrats in Congress to actually cut off funding for the war and have the troops come home in a hurry.
Well, for the Republicans in Congress to do it.
Right.
I mean, it's only possible
even at this point, it's not quite yet plausible, as we've seen, for the Democrats in the end back down from the Bush veto, and they weren't willing to defund the troops. I mean, Hillary Clinton was willing to make that vote, but the Democratic leadership wasn't.
But it doesn't matter. I mean, there was no defunding. There's no defunding the troops. The votes aren't there for that. It's not going to happen.
Right.
And I mean, first of all, we shouldn't be in this situation to begin with. You don't fund things. You don't need emergency. You don't put things through on emergency appropriations bills that are part of a entirely predictable 4-year operation. So that whole gimmick was forced on them by the White House to begin with, to force the question in just those terms of do you defund the troops or not. I don't think there will never be an act of defunding the troops.
Right, no, I guess you're right. The only thing there would be enough votes to override a veto
right.
and impose a deadline for withdrawal.
That's right.
Right.
That's right. And
yeah.
if that's the case, it will be because there is not a majority of Republicans, but a hugely significant minority of Republicans, and essentially it will be the Republicans deciding to end the war. And I think if that's the case, I mean, I think that the interest, then the political argument will be, that moment when the helicopters are pulling people off the embassy it has to be on a Democratic watch. You know what? This camera is zooming in on me again. I need to lean forward and adjust this thing before.
Our viewers need more mark.
They've got at the moment they have a ridiculous amount of bad skin. Here, hold on. Maybe I can make this work. It's all held together with Scotch tape, and we're going to use another piece of Scotch tape to make this thing work. Okay. Let's see what we can do. Okay, sorry about that.
That's totally fine.
All right, let's see if that holds for a minute or two, and we'll tell Bob that we've got some problems with the equipment.
One interesting thing then to change the subject just a little back to Edwards talk about the war vote and the sort of original controversy over the Democrats' vote to authorize the war in Iraq. You've just had Bob Schrum come out with his new book, which I haven't read, and you haven't read. Am I right?
I have not read it.
But like,
and I'm gonna. It's not even going to be sitting around waiting to be read. Some books are not.
Exactly. But it's already been picked over, fortunately.
Yes, I'm confident that I'm aware of what's in it.
Yes. So we know what's in it, and one of the things that's in it is Schrum saying that Kerry and Edwards, who were both his clients at the time, voted for the Iraq War in part at his urging, in spite of the fact that they thought it was a bad idea.
Right.
Again, Matt Iglesias, I'm just quoting him repeatedly to increase traffic to the Atlantic's website.
Who's that guy? I never heard of him. I'm sorry.
He made the point that if you think a war is a bad idea, then it doesn't, and you aren't, say, facing a really tough re-election campaign, it makes no sense to vote to authorize it because, by the time it reaches a point where it could do you any political damage, in theory you'll be vindicated.
Right.
The war will have proved a bad idea. And and in response to that, I said, and I think it's an important point, that it's very possible to believe that a war is a bad idea and still think that it's going to prove enduringly popular.
Oh, yeah.
And I think that in fact is, I mean, it doesn't necessarily place Kerry and Edwards in a better light, but I don't think that, if they really voted for it out of political calculation, the fact that they thought it was a bad idea isn't the same thing as them thinking that it was going to end up where it ended up, with, only 30% of the country approving of it.
Right. That's right. I mean, I think even for people who opposed the war, you think about all the possible scenarios, and this is actually kind of the worst case scenario, and there's a good chance that the scenarios are less bad, or that the costs are the negative consequences of it may be way out in the long term.
Well, right.
They may be the equivalent of the U.S. involvement in Afghanistan in the Reagan years, which was nobody thought of as any kind of debacle at the time, but did have obviously had some long-term costs, and everybody was still scarred. Somebody like Schrum and Kerry, they are very self-conscious about having voted against the first Gulf War,
right?
Of which there were real reasons to believe that would not turn out as well as it did.
And again, it's a case where there are people who believe on some good evidence that the first Gulf War, in spite of seeming to have turned out well, was a terrible mistake, and the evidence that it was a terrible mistake was that, it trapped us in Saudi Arabia, it inspired all this Islamic radicalism, But blowback arguments, it's very hard to reap any political benefit, it seems to me, from blowback arguments. The wars where you reap benefit from when they go badly are wars that go badly the way this one has. Right.
But, which is absolutely right. But it's still, I mean, you shouldn't make the calculation that if I really think it's a bad idea, in the end, in the end, I'll be vindicated politically.
Right.
But there is a tendency. I mean, I think the Democrats are just beginning to come out of this long shell-shocked era where all you did was sit there. I mean, when I worked up on the Hill, I felt like all they ever did was sit there and figure out which awful Jesse Helms amendment or some other thing do I have to vote for, and which can I just vote against? And the idea of just sort of doing what's right was too scary a thing. And sometimes you want to sort of shake these people. And my boss Bill Bradley was great about this. Others, they were all sort of on a range from Profile and Courage on one hand to Max Baucus on the other. You just want to shake them and say, "What are you here? Why are you here? Why are you here if all you do is vote for things that you think are bad ideas? What's the purpose of politics if that's all you're doing?" And at some point, you sort of have to say, I mean, what's the worst thing than voting against a war that turns out not badly, and as a result, you know what, you're not in a good position to run for president?
But
that's not the end of the world.
Right. But everything can be justified by the belief that you're going to be president someday,
right. And
then you'll set everything to rights.
Right. But I think this has been, as much as people took a certain lesson from the Gulf War vote, which actually didn't have terribly negative consequences. I mean, it was kind of helpful, I think, for Gore that he'd voted for it.
Yeah, it was,
but not huge, and I don't think any senators can be said to have really lost election as a result of it. Now there'll be I think there'll be a reminder that there is a value to following your best judgment. But it is hard. I mean, it's always hard on foreign policy because your best judgment. You can't not have trust in the chief. It's hard to live in a world where you can't trust the chief executive.
Right. Yes.
To really say I'm going to say my judgment about this intelligence or whatever based on whatever I've been told that I know is limited is better than the judgment of the chief executive. That's a dramatic move, I think, in foreign policy. Not as dramatic.
It is, although I'm sort of, I haven't, and it's been shaped in part by the Iraq War, but, maybe it would be better if we had more arguments about going to war that didn't just revolve around the details of intelligence.
Right.
And historically speaking, and I guess when the Iraq War happened, it seemed like this was how things were going to be from here on out. We were going to be fighting wars, based on sketchy intelligence, known knowns, unknown knowns, and all the rest of it. But historically speaking, we didn't get into the Korean War because of intelligence. We didn't get into World War I or World War II because of intelligence. And the war that we did get into, we didn't get into Gulf War I because of intelligence. It was simply a straightforward, do we eject him from Kuwait or not?
Right.
And the last time we got into a war where it was a question of trusting the president was, Gulf of Tonkin and Vietnam.
Right.
And maybe the lesson here is if the justification for going to war has to rest on trusting the president, then something might be amiss in our war making.
You could not have put that more articulately if you were, writing on Daily Kos, Ross. I mean, that is it's been a long 4 years in conservative foreign policy circles, Mark. And yeah, I'll say no. That is a very good way to put it. I mean, if it's that complicated that you need to get into that level of nuance, maybe war is probably not the answer, and certainly that's a significant question to be raised about Iran as well. I mean, it is hypothetically possible that there is some fact which is not. I mean, that's the thing about that's the thing I think about the 9/11 paradigm that's built up around us. There are things that it becomes possible that there are invisible things out there.
Right.
And,
well, yeah.
But once you say that, you're inherently putting huge amounts of power into the person or the institution of the executive that claims it has knowledge of what these invisible things are.
Well, no, and this was the paradox of the conservative case for war was that on the one hand, a lot of people on the right spent their time denigrating the intelligence services and saying, well, they failed us so many times and we need to completely shake them up and they're this stale bureaucracy and so on. And on the other hand, you were making a case for war that was entirely dependent on intelligence.
Right.
And in fact, I mean, the conservative critique of the intelligence establishment, not the part that said they aren't aggressive enough, but the sort of generalized, they're, out of date and don't know what they're doing, that critique was totally correct.
Sure.
But
sure.
In the event, that we went to war based on intelligence. So.
Right. Right.
Well, having boxed me into a Daily Kos corner on foreign policy, maybe we should turn to domestic policy, and I'm not going to box you into any corners, but there's been Barack Obama released his health care plan, I guess, last week, and it was sort of picked over, and there was some dissatisfaction on the left that it didn't go far enough in particular towards mandates, sort of basically forcing people to buy health insurance in the manner of auto insurance, which is the hot idea both on the left and in some parts of the right, and I've been attracted to it from time to time. But why don't you tell me your doubtless more detailed and more informed thoughts on Barack Obama's health care plan?
Okay, I mean it's an interesting phenomenon. I mean, I'm here at New America Foundation, which has been promoting the individual mandate as an element of health care reform for a number of years. Dealt with this a little bit when I worked on Bill Bradley's healthcare plan in 2000, and there's a funny phenomenon that happened, which is sometime in the last year or two, the idea of the individual mandate for healthcare, which is simply an absolute requirement that that you must purchase health insurance, and then we build a whole system that makes it affordable and requires insurers to do community rating and guaranteed issue and all those things, so that you are able to buy health insurance, whether you're unemployed, self-employed, work for a company that doesn't provide health insurance, whatever. You're able to access that market, which currently you're not. I mean, that's not a realistic concept. If you just sort of said right now, it's like car insurance, everybody has to go buy health insurance, you just trap people because there's no possibility of doing it. But you build the subsidies, you build the structures, you make it possible. That was a kind of wacky centrist idea a few years ago that had a lot of critics on the left,
Right.
And when Schwarzenegger came out with it just a few months ago, had a lot of critics on the left who talked about you're criminalizing the uninsured and things like that, because there's always a worry, and this is the case in Massachusetts where they have some of that individual mandate. There's always a worry that if you have the mandate without sufficient subsidies and without cracking down on the insurance companies enough that you make them actually make reasonably priced policies available, you are going to just trap people. You're going to force people to buy something that they can't possibly afford. And somewhere in there, it shifted, and now it's well understood that the individual mandate is an essential element of any kind of reform plan, and so Edwards goes after Obama last night and says, you've got to have the mandate,
Yeah, no, it's kind of astonishing to me too.
It's a really interesting shift, and it's correct. It's absolutely correct. Obama made about the best case you could. He made, I think, a very appealing case, in fact, of saying, the first thing I hear people are concerned about affordability. I want to make sure that we make all of this affordable to people before we, if eventually we need a mandate because we find out that, young, healthy people are basically freeloading by not buying health insurance. If that's the case, we'll consider a mandate. But the most important thing is affordability and making this thing available and affordable to people. And so forth. And it's very, basically said something like, I don't know anybody who doesn't want to have health insurance, which, of course, in theory, that's true. The reality is, though, as probably a lot of people in your cohort and people without children and so forth, a lot of people simply don't buy health insurance, and it's not because it's because they think they're immortal,
Right. Well, and statistically speaking, it's not really a good gamble because the stakes are so high. You are gambling with your life. But if you're young and reasonably healthy, if I had not had health insurance for the past few years, my costs would have been extremely low.
Exactly. And what you've been doing by having health insurance for the last few years is you are contributing into a system in which at the moment you are a net contributor. And
right.
Sometime in the future you will maybe not, but it's there for you if at some point in the future you are a net taker based on the contributions you put in now. And it's not going to be fair. And nobody's healthy people are going to pay more than they take out of the system. That's part of life, and the benefit is they're healthy. But it is important to make the system work that you have everybody in that pool. If only it's a basic concept of insurance adverse selection and so forth. So you can't really make the system work in a way that's affordable and that insurance is available to everybody unless you have the mandate in place, because simply you're going to have more high cost people in the system and fewer low cost people in the system, and that's going to throw the whole thing out of balance. But it's interesting. It's interesting how the interesting question about Obama I got the sense last night that it is in fact the candidate's deep-seated instinct that making it available and affordable first is a value, and the mandate is not something you want to push so hard. And I get a sense of a little surprise about the backlash and how strong the consensus is that there needs to be a mandate. And it is funny. When I worked on Bill Bradley's campaign in 2000, one of the critiques from the left, from Al Gore, was there was a mandate, and it was a mandate for kids. It was actually a mandate. Obama has the mandate for kids as well.
Right. No, I remember this. Yeah.
And it was and the critique from Gore is, well, you're telling people they've got to go buy something and it might not be available to them, and so forth. So I don't know. It's just funny how the ground changes. I'm glad to see it change.
And it's an interesting phenomenon too, because there's sort of a double effect, not double effect, that's the wrong term, but sort of a double move in a way on the part of a lot of liberals and Democrats and people who are interested in policy, where it's fairly clear to me that most of the smart people on the left, if asked to design a healthcare system, would support a single-payer healthcare system,
right?
And that mandate is essentially a compromise that's being undertaken for what are in many ways good politically expedient reasons. But it's interesting to see people now so passionately invested in something that they themselves fundamentally believe is actually only a compromise that's necessitated by the overall political landscape in America. And I'm surprised, frankly, that maybe I'm foolish to be surprised, but I'm surprised that John Edwards isn't actually the candidate of single-payer health.
That's right. I mean, it's funny. It's actually very weird that even at the moment where there's a little more, my colleague Phil Longman writing about how valuable the VA healthcare system is.
Well, Phil Longman, there's almost no one I respect more than Phil Longman. He's not even arguing for, most single-payer people say, well, we need to have national health insurance, but we don't want to end up like Britain, where the state runs the hospitals. And I'm right that Longman is just arguing straightforwardly that we need government-run healthcare.
Well, he's making an empirical argument, which is to say, if you look at the VA system, which is a government-run system, and people go through the same hospitals, and all the incentives are there to keep people healthy that don't exist in the private insurance system, all evidence is that's a better system, at least for that cohort. In a sense, it's a statement. It's an argument about a system. I'm not sure it's completely an argument. I guess it is. I guess it's an argument for.
Well, I know, and I'm not saying. Yeah. I'm not criticizing it. I think it's a pretty impressive empirical case that he's mustered. But it's just it's interesting to me that when someone like Phil Longman is going as far as he's willing to go, that someone like John Edwards, who is in theory and in practice casting himself as the standard bearer for the left of the Democratic Party in this election, has become he's got Mitt Romney's health care plan. Not really, right, but he does.
Yeah.
He's got the centrist health care plan.
Yeah. Whereas in fact, what's funny, because Obama, and they played it down, they didn't tell the story quite right. There's a very big public program that's part of Obama's plan, so that if you don't have health insurance for any reason, you kind of default into this public program. Which is a little bit like the Medicare for All as described by as proposed by Jacob Hacker. You default into the public program. You could choose a private insurance thing that's administered through this national exchange, so that it has to meet all the standards of the public program. But it'd probably be more expensive than the public program, because the public program is going to have lower administrative costs. That's a system that a lot of people would say would turn very quickly into something like single payer, because employers would bail out, people would fall into the public system. The public system would, in fact, be preferable to private systems. And, at the end of the day, you have single payer. If you just added the mandate to Obama, it's actually funny that it is, in fact, closer to single payer in the end than anything else. At the same time, I hate all this garbage about the plans. I said this the last time I did Blogging Heads with Mike Lind. We both agreed. This ritual of producing these detailed plans on every issue, where it's not like in the hothouse of a campaign. It's not like you're going to do that great a healthcare plan. You're going to make mistakes. You're going to you're going to face pressure. Somebody's going to rewrite something over here. Some speechwriter is not going to understand something. He's going to write it differently. It inevitably happens. And we pick over these things. And I just looked at the Republican candidates' websites over the weekend, because I was writing yet another thing about this. Do not put out plans. There are no plans on Republican candidates' websites.
Well, yeah, but but where are the Republicans today? I don't.
You think they should have 20-page plans?
Well, I think the absence of plans on the Republican side tells you something extremely significant about a serious problem in the Republican Party right now. I also think that there is the value of the plan, and actually my instinct might be, well, one thing is, of course, you have to produce a plan once everyone else has produced a plan. So
right.
there is that effect. You can't just be Barack Obama and say, well, Edwards has a plan, I'm going to have a plan.
Right. See, what I would do, the great move, if I were advising Barack Obama, I would say, you know what your great move is? Is just like say, you know what's a good plan? John Edwards' plan's a good plan. I like it. That's the kind of thing I'd look for if I was president. Yeah, I would totally, and everybody would be like, what? What just happened? Talking about changing the game. But nobody asked.
That's such a risk. You can't take risks. But yeah, well, I mean, the other thing with the plan is that it does have the virtue. And I mean, maybe you don't have to do this. Maybe you can say, if Barack Obama runs for president and just said, I want universal health care, and didn't produce a plan, and then won the election, he could say, I have a mandate for universal health care.
Right.
But there is a sort of, there is the element of, after you've won the election, the kind of follow-through you want to have, there's a virtue in having sort of had some of these issues hashed out on the campaign trail, and having had them picked over by your opposition. If you're the candidate who emerges on top, you'll end up being strengthened. In a sense, your hand will be strengthened. You can say, well, we put it to the people, and the people said yes to the individual mandate. Maybe. I mean, you obviously have to say something. If you win an election and you've never said a thing about what you're going to do, like, for example, George Bush basically denying that he was going to privatize Social Security and then declaring that he had a mandate to do Social Security privatization, that's the opposite extreme. Obviously, that was one of the reasons that he had a problem doing that. If he'd actually said he was going to do that, he wouldn't have been reelected. If he'd said he was going to do that and had won, he probably would have gotten a little further than he did with that approach. But I don't think you need it's the level of detail, it's the sense that everybody has to have their unique plan becomes a problem. And it's very rare that these things sort of remain resilient through the general election and so forth. Often they're very quickly. It's hard. I mean, maybe we're in a new era where people are not thinking of the primary and the general election in totally different terms, and I think that's one of Obama's strengths is that he's not. But the Shrum approach to politics is, you do one thing in the primaries, and then you carve to the right for the general election. I mean, it's the typical approach. It'd be hard to advise. And actually, in a way, this election may prove a good test of both those theories, because the Republicans seem to be following the old model, and I think it's safe to say that once somebody emerges as the Republican standard bearer, that they will feel the need to come up with some kind of a healthcare plan. I mean,
right.
It's possible that that they won't. And when Rudy Giuliani talks about healthcare, he seems to be sort of dismissive of the idea that any kind of healthcare reform is needed. But for, particularly Mitt Romney clearly has carved out a Shrum-style strategy where I'm sure that if the second Mitt Romney won the Republican nomination, he would talk about nothing but having been the guy who brought universal health care to Massachusetts.
Right. Whereas he won't bring himself to talk about it at all now.
Right. In the primaries. Yeah. And I think similar things would probably happen with John McCain and God knows, maybe Fred Thompson. So in fact, maybe that's our segue, because the next thing we're going to talk about is the Republican side and Fred Thompson.
Okay.
So why don't we segue to that?
Okay, that's your expertise. I should interview you about that.
So my expertise, yeah. I mean, my sense of Thompson, my initial sense of him, and I partially stand by it, is that one, he's quite a formidable candidate in the Republican primary season, just because the field is weak across the board. Right. On not weak, in a sense, you have a very strong field. Many of the people running have very impressive qualifications, but it's weak in terms of, the same thing everyone's always talked about, in terms of people appealing to the rock-ribbed conservative base and so on, and being able to check all the boxes down the line that, the conservative movement, you check to say, I am the conservative candidate. Thompson, while he has some sort of, background issues with campaign finance reform, and he was pro-choice once upon a time, is much better positioned than anyone else to be the down-the-line, check-the-boxes candidate. That makes him a strong figure. He's also, personally fairly charming. He's sort of affable, easygoing. All those are strengths. And then my sense of his weakness was that, he's the 48% candidate. He's the guy you nominate if you want to lose respectably. He's not a risky figure to nominate. The base will rally around him. You won't have, if Giuliani won the nomination, you might have a pro-life protest candidate who would siphon off 3% of the vote. That won't happen with Fred Thompson. You won't have a protest immigration candidate who siphons off some of the vote. All that won't happen. But I think he's probably someone who's going to lose because he doesn't, the Republican Party is at the moment a 48% of the country party, and it's going to be a bad year for Republicans most likely. He doesn't take the party in any new and interesting directions, so there you have it.
But I can't see, this is, you made a good presentation about this a few weeks ago, and there were two issues that I had there. One is, Thompson's always seemed to me, I don't know that much about him, but he's always seemed to me kind of lazy, kind of indifferent. And that's part of his charm, in fact. He's a senator, then he decides not to be a senator anymore. That typically doesn't happen. Usually you remain unless you're gearing up to run for president, or you have your 90th birthday, or you lose. You're a senator, you stay a senator. Some people can't stand being a senator because they want to be a governor and really run things. He didn't even have that. And it wasn't, there's a sort of part of his affability is this lack of intensity and lack of engagement, and lack of what I perceived as lack of ambition. Now at this presentation you did a few weeks ago with somebody from the Weekly Standard, both of you I think made the argument that in fact he's very engaged with policy, he's very serious and so forth. But I've seen
this is what I've heard.
Yeah, I've seen other
from people I trust within the conservative movement who were surprised, who had that impression of Thompson, and were then surprised upon meeting him to find that he was much more engaged than your average DC politician.
But I've seen other accounts that are basically the same, support the lazy, disengaged, happy to take whatever office is given to him, and not otherwise. Well, which can be a great strength. I've always felt one of the big problems with John Kerry was people perceived him as sort of too crazed with ambition, and that George Bush, I think, actually seems less ambitious. Clinton was ambitious in a way that I think didn't freak people out as much. But I think we have a complicated relationship to ambition in this country. But you have to have enough of it. It's a lot of work to run for president. If you're not having a good time doing that, the way Clinton did, you can't do it. You're not going to do it.
Well, in particular, the reason that could be a strength, I think, in this field in particular is, this may be less true for McCain, although it's also his second run for president, so clearly, his ambition is out there for all to see. But both Giuliani and Romney, I think, in different ways, are sort of, and the knock on them would be they are sort of pure ambition, sort of ambition distilled, and it manifests itself in one way with Rudy, and in the sort of I'll be whatever you want me to be way with Romney, and being a sort of slightly lazy, more comfortable in your own skin kind of guy could be a strength.
Right.
Maybe.
And McCain has some of that Clinton aspect of just having fun out there. And when you have that aspect of him, I think it's very appealing. And then there's this sort of angry, irascible side to him.
And I feel like we've seen more of that side than we have of the fun this time around.
And what's funny is you've seen much more of the fun side of Giuliani. Those of us who lived in New York during that period, we sort of only know the crazy side of Giuliani. But actually, that's, I think, one of the funny phenomena of Giuliani's, it's really beginning to slope downwards. But his persistence as a Republican frontrunner is that people from New York actually don't know about this, the deranged side of him.
People who aren't from New York.
People who are not from New York. They have a sense of him on September 11th as, doing the right thing. They have a sense that he did a good job in helping turn New York around and reducing crime and so forth. But they don't have that sense of his personality. where the really vicious side of his personality, which Mike Tomasky wrote about in the Prospect, and it's got all kinds of dimensions, and it really goes, it even goes back to when he was a prosecutor and took these, poor Wall, it made you sympathetic for minor Wall Street crooks as he, went in and hauled them out in handcuffs in broad daylight with TV cameras around. There's a gentleness and a humor to Giuliani that you're seeing now that nobody, it's like, this is not, it's like, the medicine has been adjusted or something like that. And we'll see how long it lasts. But I want to say my other thing about your point about Thompson being a 48% candidate or whatever. I don't understand how a party. I know you're not a spokesman for the Republican Party. I'm not going to.
Clearly not.
I'm not going to treat you as one. But I get a sense of this even with some people who are more. There's a kind of complacency about that, which is really weird. I mean, I understand that sometimes that just happens. Dole. By the time you got to the turn of the year, everybody knew Dole was going to lose. Everybody knew Mondale was going to lose in 1984. But, in the odd-numbered year, they didn't. It wasn't clear that Reagan was going to win re-election at this point in 1983. It wasn't clear that Clinton was going to win re-election at this point in 1995. It definitely wasn't clear. And so a sequence of events were put in place that wound up with, well, the opportunity really wasn't there. Even though you thought it was there, but it was a re-election of a popular president. I don't see how a party can operate in a way that's so complacent about losing the presidency when in fact the presidency has been this essential thing.
Yeah, I don't think it's complacency though. I think that it's there's a sense in which the conservative movement has been kind of traumatized. I think by the Bush years. I mean, there's been such, it's almost like there's so much going on. There's been so much going on in the Bush years, and he starts out and he's the compassionate conservative, and we're going to have to compromise on size of government issues and the earned income tax credit in order to get elected, and he's running a humble foreign policy. And then the next thing it's 9/11, and he's the war president, and you're going to have to, and we're going to rally around the flag, and, and we're going to have to accept civil liberties, and this is civil liberties violations, and this is the compromise that we have to make for this president. And I mean, this is there are all these arguments going on now on the right about, what are the lessons of the Bush years? And I think one of the things that's interesting is that because so much has happened, and because the president's persona has changed in many ways over the course of the 6 years, it's almost like every part of the conservative movement has been, at one point or another, traumatized by this administration. And so, and you can see this with immigration now, where, this sort of Jacksonian nationalist side of the party, which despite misgivings about the whole crusade for freedom theory, has really been the core of the president's support. Particularly on Iraq. We're in it to win it. This is the central front on the war on terror. All of that, and suddenly, you have the president going around accusing them of being yahoos on immigration, which is one of the weirder spectacles I've ever seen. Frankly, and I'm only 27 years old, so I haven't seen that many weird spectacles. But a president with a 28%, 35% approval rating, going around the country attacking his own base on an issue, and so in that sense, Thompson, he doesn't. I think Peggy Noonan may have made this point a while ago during the period when she was slowly turning on President Bush, but. You get the sense with Bush that it's all been about, we're making history. We're making history here. We're making history in the Middle East. We're making history by, having amnesty and, having comprehensive immigration reform. It can't just be immigration reform. It has to be comprehensive. And Thompson is none of that. And the thing that Thompson has done really well, and this is the thing that has slightly changed, I mean, his poll numbers have gone down a bit since he, first was floated as a name, and, he may not go anywhere, but the one thing that's changed my impression of him as a 48%er is how cleverly he's played to the conservative base as a non-candidate over the past 4 months. Just in terms of finding the things where a divided party and a divided movement, the things that they aren't even important things, but the things they agree on, like filming a YouTube video making fun of Michael Moore. I mean, this is smart. It's not important politics, but it's smart politics. Or doing radio commentaries where you talk about the menace of radical Islam in Europe. Now, what's the U.S. policy on the menace of radical Islam in Europe? There really isn't one. But it's something that conservatives agree is important. It's something they like to hear people talking about, and it's something where they can all agree, and there isn't some huge inter-party fight going on.
Right.
And
they're not all reading 28,000-word Paul Berman essays about it.
Well, right. I mean, that was where we were going to finish up. So I guess.
And I don't want to go there quite yet, but because before we do that, I want to talk about Fareed Zakaria's column, which I think was in the Post this morning. I read it yesterday on MSNBC.
Oh, I didn't read the column. When we talked about this before, I thought you meant maybe it was a distillation of his Newsweek piece. But what's the?
Well, I'm not sure what appears where, but somebody was talking about it as his column today. I read it on I guess it would be Newsweek. But it was basically making the point, and this is not a radical guy by any means, making the point that the Republican. The only way the Republicans have found to deal with the crackdown of conservatism is to kind of crank this the craziness about war on terror up to a level that's actually more that makes Bush look reasonable. And he quoted Romney from that past debate, which was what jumped out at me about where he said, it's not bin Laden we have to go after. It's because Romney had made the mistake of saying bin Laden's not that big of a deal. So to get out of that, he says it's not bin Laden we have to go after. It's it's Sunni and Shia and the Muslim Brotherhood and boom boom boom. As the sort of you got to kill them all. Kind of rhetoric, and Rudy Giuliani, who really sort of seems, in a sense, there's a lot of things Rudy Giuliani could talk about. And presents himself as this sort of the apocalyptic politics, and all you can do with apocalyptic politics is kind of crank it up higher and higher. That's not exactly a paraphrase of Fareed's piece,
right? No, but that's I think
what
it
I
is
take from
piece.
it. Yeah.
Well, no, and I think that's. I mean, it's been one of the, as someone who has moved in a more, I guess you could say, realist direction because of the Iraq War in the internecine right-wing foreign policy debates. It's been very depressing to watch the primary candidates where the only, it seems that the only position they feel comfortable differing with this administration on is. Being more hawkish and more militaristic, and I mean Romney is the textbook example because he's the candidate who seems to have decided I'm going to do what people want, and that's how I'm going to get the nomination. And Romney, he was governor of Massachusetts. He comes from sort of an old line Republican family, and I sort of had the idea that, in a field with McCain and Giuliani, Romney's natural role would be sort of as the more realist, sober-minded standard bearer. And instead, he's the guy going around saying, we're going to double Gitmo. I don't even know what that means. How do you double Gitmo? It's just like, there's sort of a purity to the
Zachariah had a great line about that. He's like, a space problem is not the problem.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
And so I agree with you, and I don't think. I mean, I think some of that is just the Iraq War has to come to an end in some way, shape, or form before conservatives can move past it. Although I don't know. I mean, I'm not sure. If you look at, for instance, the numbers in Iowa, and admittedly Iowa is the most isolationist state in the union, but more than 50% of Republican primary voters. Think the Iraq War was a mistake or want us to withdraw immediately or something. I mean, it still seems like there's some percentage of Republican voters who are out there who could be appealed to by someone other than Ron Paul.
Well, sure, it's a total
but it's not.
niche.
But overall, you look at the numbers, you look at what Republican primary voters are concerned about. They're concerned about the war. They're concerned about terrorism, and the candidates have decided that this is a primary that's going to be decided on who can persuade Republican voters that they can win the war in Iraq.
Right.
And
right.
That's where we are. Go on, sorry.
Maybe that's made worse by the fact that you have these leading candidates who they can't make themselves pure on social issues.
Right.
I mean, it's happenstance that that of the top three, McCain of what has been the top three, McCain, Romney, and Giuliani are all kind of mistrusted in one way or another on those issues. They can't change that. So the issues have to change. There's the old saying among campaign people, it's like, if the issue environment isn't working for you, change the issue environment. They have no choice except to almost in unison change the issue environment totally to apocalyptic foreign policy.
Yeah, but it's interesting to see that it isn't just. I mean, I guess every candidate thinks they're going to win. So, but it's not just the front runners. I mean, it's the Tommy Thompson and Mike Huckabee and Sam Brownback. I mean, there's clearly a sustained conservative critique of the war in Iraq and the entire Bush administration foreign policy that only Ron Paul is even gesturing at.
Right.
And
well, I mean, I think there are others. I mean, I think that Brownback and certainly Jim Gilmore. I mean, these guys are going nowhere. I mean, I think Brownback has really really fallen off. The others were never even close to it. Tommy Thompson is profoundly unimpressive.
Right. But why not?
They are trying to construct an argument. They're trying to construct more than just. They're trying to. They at least are trying to construct a full conservative viewpoint. Gilmore in particular, right?
I mean, to be honest, I haven't.
I think so. I mean, I don't know.
I think Brownback has. Brownback represents a coherent worldview. It's compassionate conservatism, literally as a complete worldview. It's like we're intervening in Darfur, we're having comprehensive immigration reform, but it's not. It hasn't been a critique of the Iraq War, and he expressed some skepticism about the surge, but that never turned into any kind of sustained critique.
Right.
I don't know. I mean, the only other thing about this Kerry piece that I mentioned is it contained what I agreed with it largely in substance. It contained this, to me, deeply annoying line about the Republicans and immigration, where the sort of the base's reaction to comprehensive immigration reform. Kerry was casting this as an example of how Republicans are just going crazy and so on, and that kind of analysis just annoys the heck out of me, because it's immigration reform is something that of this kind is something that nobody on the conservative side was crying out for, and President Bush has made it his mission to foist what nobody seems to think is good legislation on the country. And yet there's this sort of weird default. I'm sure if you sat Fareed Zakaria down with this immigration bill and said, "Hey, Fareed, do you really think this is a good mix of policies?" He would you'd probably convince him that no, it's not. But there's this desire to appear, better than the yahoos on the conservative side, and there are tons of yahoos on the conservative side who just hate Mexicans, and that's true. But it doesn't change the fact that in this case the yahoos are probably right, to my mind at least.
Okay. Well, I don't do immigration policy because I'm basically just like open borders.
That's the current. Well, fair enough. Then let's.
But I'm interested in the politics of it. And what's interesting to me is there is a belief. I mean, Jim Pinkerton made this argument to me a few weeks ago. And others, there's a belief that even if this starts as hostility towards Republican elites, it becomes like the Panama Canal Treaty, that it actually breathes life into conservative Republicanism and ultimately kills Democrats. But I'm not seeing that happen. I mean, I think it only tears up the Republican coalition.
I don't think this kind of maybe if I can see some political sequence of events where it ends up benefiting the Republican coalition, but you need so much to change. I mean, you can't have the president of your party confirming the mass media stereotype of your party's base.
Right.
I mean, it just seems, yeah.
That's right. You can't have that. And then on top of that, you once again, the reaction of the base, exaggerated by the president's perception of it, once again deepens the rift between Latinos and the Republican Party, which was an alliance which was there to be built.
Exactly. Well, and this is the thing.
But it has been blown up again.
And Latino voters, again, this is egregious generalizations, but Latino voters, it's unclear that amnesty is particularly high on the list of Latino voters' concerns.
Well, it's one of those things that plays out totally differently in different regions,
right,
and different,
exactly. And different,
what generation you are,
different generations, what country you've come from, all of that.
Yeah.
But in the broadest conception of things, it is perfectly possible to imagine the Republicans continuing to expand their share of the Latino vote without doing anything about comprehensive immigration reform.
Right. I mean, you could have done nothing, and the Republican Party could have reached out to Latinos on other issues, on social issues and education. I mean, you'd have to be you'd have to ultimately, as you've always argued, you have to have a government that does a little more. But you could certainly, the base was there to do it, and you could certainly expand on it.
Right, and it's Latinos aren't. You're not going to win them by opening the borders. But
right.
You can certainly lose them by picking a fight within your own party that makes your party look nativist.
Absolutely.
So,
and they learned that. I mean, the thing is, that's the story of the Republican Party in California. That's the Pete Wilson story. I don't know how many times you have to learn this story.
Yeah, although the Pete Wilson story is sort of. The Pete Wilson story is brought up by Karl Rove and others repeatedly as an example of, the Republicans lost California forever because of Proposition 186 or 189? I can never remember.
I think it was 186. I think the big one was the no schools for...
Right. And actually, the evidence, clearly that hurt Republicans among Latinos in California, the evidence that, broadly speaking, the reason California has been trending Democratic isn't because, it is because Republicans lost Latinos, but it's more importantly because there have been ever more Latinos in California, and first-generation Latino immigrants, like most first-generation immigrants, are natural Democrats. They're not natural Republicans, and the idea that they're natural Republicans is just... Anyway, I'm sorry. I'm somewhat frustrated on this topic, as you can probably tell.
Right. But, the interesting thing to me, I always think there's the interesting thing is to understand the different politics, but between a place like California where Latino immigration is all into well-structured into an existing social and political structure.
Right.
Although increasingly less so because it's away from L.A. City and into the county and directly into the Central Valley, versus the kind of immigration, I think this drives a lot of the politics too, the kind of immigration that's, where we're seeing, recent Latino immigration into areas that have not had high levels of immigration in the past. So, for example, Chris Caldwell wrote a piece a while back about,
Delaware, right?
Delaware, that area around Georgetown, Delaware, and you see that you see that in Georgia, pretty much probably all through the South, where all of a sudden people are actually, the idea that there's 5 kids in my son's school who don't speak English is a big deal because that's never happened before. So it's sort of disorienting, and the people and the immigrants, there's not a built-in structure of community, except there is in fact a lot of church involvement. That seems to me that's just a very different kind of politics, where it actually could be more beneficial to the Republicans, but also where the immigration itself is more disturbing and incites more opposition, as opposed to places where it's more established. But I'm just speculating about how that
and different, and politically it plays out. When you have cities in the Southwest that in certain ways look like old-fashioned machine democratic cities, where you have increasingly, Los Angeles in particular, but increasingly Latino machines instead of Irish and Italian machines,
right.
And that's a completely different kind of immigration politics than what you're getting in North Carolina or something.
Right. Where they also don't, they're not as likely to vote, in fact, because they're not being brought into the system. Well, we are at about an hour and 3 minutes. We were going to talk about your great accomplishment, which is actually to read that Paul Berman essay, but I only read half of it.
Well, do you want to? Why don't we talk about it for 4 minutes then?
4 minutes about it. This is
I read it. It was 28,000 words.
This is the cover of the New Republic about Tariq Ramadan.
Right.
Had you given much thought to him previously?
I'm sorry?
Had you given much thought to Tariq Ramadan previously?
I had not given. I'd read the Ian Baruma piece about Tariq Ramadan in the New York Times Magazine that Berman was responding to, and I had sort of a generalized awareness of what Tariq Ramadan represents, which is, I guess you could call it moderate Islamism in Europe, a sort of attempt to take, he's the grandson and son of figures associated with the Muslim Brotherhood in Europe, I mean in Egypt and the Middle East, and Ramadan is attempting to sort of, or what, one interpretation of what he's doing is attempting to find an accommodation between political Islam, the sort of, and Western liberalism.
Right.
And the Berman essay is a very weird piece, I thought, and what it shows is that conservatives aren't the only ones facing some ideological tensions these days, and there's a very interesting debate going on among liberals in particular over, how do you address the sort of movement of political Islam into Western Europe, and do you look for figures like Ramadan who are perhaps moderates, even though, and Berman has this long riff on how Ramadan, was refused to outright condemn the stoning of women for adultery and would only call for a moratorium on it. So, people who are, in certain contexts, seem to be enemies of liberalism, but may also be, you may also be able to accommodate them within liberalism and so forth. And so Berman was essentially arguing with the people who want to have dialogue in some sense with Tariq Ramadan and see him as a plausible figure to spearhead the integration of Islam and Muslim immigrants into liberal societies.
Right.
But the Berman piece was weird because it was 28,000 words long. It went on and on and on and circled around all these topics, and clearly it wanted to be a piece that said, look, really Tariq Ramadan is a stalking horse for bin Laden and theocracy, and he's a threat to liberalism. Right. But it neither had the evidence to say it, nor it was also afraid of saying it, because it didn't want to be associated with, the Mark Stein vision of Europe going under an Islamist tide and so on. It wanted to be reasonable and fair-minded and all these things. And so it circled and circled and circled and ended up with a celebration of Ayaan Hirsi Ali, who is, the sort of the champion of secularization in the Islamic world, but didn't really say anything and took up a large chunk of the New Republic, which is a magazine that sort of manifests this, I think, this struggle within the liberal mind on how to come to terms with political Islam. So it was a long, confusing, ultimately unsuccessful piece that reflected some tensions in the liberal mind, I guess.
Although I don't think it, I got through, I think, probably 14,000 words of it and quit after many hundreds of words had demonstrated to me that Ian Baruma failed to properly understand the distinction between Descartes and somebody named Al-Ghazali and their different theories of doubt. So it didn't really. It seemed to me to go in and out of actually engaging with those issues of political Islam in Europe, and get into a lot of very close textual analysis of books that I had not only hadn't read but hadn't heard of. And I don't even mean Tariq Ramadan's books. I mean like the secondary literature about Tariq Ramadan. So that if that's the debate, it just seemed very. That is an interesting debate about how you deal with political Islam, and it deals with, it goes to issues about, for example, how we think about the increase, the rise of a kind of mild political Islam in Turkey, for example.
Right.
It goes to a lot of those issues, but it didn't have any direct engagement with those issues, and so it did seem, in fact,
it engaged with them a little bit more at the end, and it became a little bit more explicit that Berman was associating himself in a way with the Ayaan Hirsi Ali, liberalism and Islamism are enemies. Liberals shouldn't be praising Islamist school of thought, but it was.
I just find with Berman, it's all interesting, but what Josh Marshall called the Orwell temptation.
Right, it's the Orwell temptation.
That desire to be the person who sees the clarity of the moral distinctions instead of fudging them. It's a personal taste. It's a kind of how you want to think of yourself in the world kind of thing, and it becomes really.
But I also do think there is this, post the Iraq War, you have, and I do think the New Republic manifests this. You have a lot of liberals who, I guess you could say, gave in to the Orwell temptation over Iraq, right, and now aren't quite sure what to do with themselves, and they're chastened in a way. And I think you can see this. I think if and I could be wrong about this, but I think if Paul Berman had written that essay before the Iraq War, it would have. It might have been a worse essay from the point of view of intellectual honesty, but it would have been a better essay to read because it would have come to a sharper point.
Right.
And I think there's exactly now
right.
the Orwell temptation now coexists right. with this fear of, you know, of the Iraq War, I guess you could say, which is where the Orwell temptation goes when it's taken too far.
That's totally right, Ross, because, I mean, that was my reaction to Peter Beinart's book, which was like, if this had been an argument for the Iraq War, right. it would at least be a coherent argument. But it's an argument for blah, 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 toughness, steadfastness, see evil where it lies, but not the Iraq War.
Right. No. You're yes.
Yeah, but that was the question. I mean, it kind of goes back to what we were talking about with the Democratic debate. That the question was not some other thing. The question was the Iraq War or no Iraq War. That's what the war on terror became. And that was the choice that was presented. And, you gotta, to the extent that we now accept that it was the wrong choice, there we are. We're stuck. And you're right. I mean, for those who, I understand that. I understood that temptation. It's sort of, I came to the edge of being a liberal hawk, but I didn't cross the line. But I understand it. Although I don't think you can be wrong. It's not the end of the world. I don't know. Yeah. I don't know that it should be that hard to get out of. I mean, you learn from this, especially you're not the decision maker. You learn from those mistakes.
Yeah, but it does. I mean, given that the war on terror intellectual landscape persists, even in even through and presumably after the Iraq War.
Right.
I don't know. I think it breeds. Yeah, it creates a weirdness. I guess, which I saw in the Berman essay.
President Romney will sort it all out for us.
That's right. Well, on that we can agree. So I guess
Ross.
We should end there. Thanks for talking, Mark.
Lovely time. Okay, take care.
Take care.